In this fourth and final video on the history of American language and communications, we'll look at the period after World War II through pretty much the present day. And this was a period where communication technology obviously exploded. First was the development of transistors, the first step in the so-called technological revolution, or the information age that would, of course, in time include a variety of telecommunications. In 1947, a group of scientists working at Bell Telephone Laboratories invented the first point contact transistors. Like vacuum tubes in the earliest computers, transistors amplified electrical current and could be used as on-off switches for electricity. More importantly, they were smaller, more reliable, and used less energy. Immediately, inventors were researching applications for transistors. One of the first applications was the pocket transistor radio, which was much smaller than radios previously. Car radios, which had been available before the war, became much more commonplace and less expensive, now usually offering FM with better fidelity than just AM radio. In the 1950s, televisions became smaller and cheaper and exploded into the commercial market. Old radio companies such as NBC, CBS, and ABC led the way in creating new television shows. Increasingly, TVs were in virtually every home, replacing the radio as the most important for information and entertainment. Regular news shows expanded and broadcasting continued into the late night, when programming ceased for the day with the national anthem. In 1953, the first color TVs were marketed, but it really wasn't until a bit later when enough programs were broadcast in color to make it worth the extra price it cost. When in the 1950s NBC decided, in fact, to produce more shows in color, the company adopted its famous peacock logo, which it still has today. In 1956, we have the emergence of the first TV remote. With broadcasting exploding after the war, the FCC adopted a fairness doctrine, requiring companies seeking public licenses to devote a certain percentage of their broadcasting to matters of public interest and, when doing so, present both sides of disputes or controversial issues. Now, during the 1960s, the expansion of satellites dramatically expanded communications globally. The first satellites were weather, but then they quickly became communication satellites as well. It was not just new technology that improved communications during the 1960s. With economic growth and increased volume, as well as new sorting machinery, the Postal Service introduced zip codes in 1963. Of course, transistors led to dramatic advances in computing technology, which from the start promised unimagined communication advances. The first integrated circuit was invented in 1958, which had a number of transistors on one plate or chip, now usually made with silicon. About the same time, a new programming language, Fortran, was developed for numerical computing. It only took a few years before a simpler coding language emerged, BASIC, which meant beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code. All of this meant more widespread use of computers and the need to, of course, to connect them, to exchange the data they're working with. To connect them, computer scientists began to use what they called floppy disk. It was a way to share data between computers. While not then known as floppy disk, the initial disks were 8 inches. Later, in the 1970s, the disks were improved and shrunk to 5.5 inches. Later still, in the 1980s, they were improved and shrunk again, this time to 3.5 inches. And that lasted until the invention of the compact disc in the 1990s. Here you can see a picture of an original 8-inch floppy disk in the processor with a smaller 3.5-inch, more modern floppy disk by its side for comparison. Just as floppy disks were beginning to be exchanged, the microprocessor was invented. The microprocessor was smaller but more powerful than simply integrated circuits, acting as sort of a brain for the other integrated circuits within it. The microprocessor dramatically improved computing technology and made the reality of a home or personal computer possible. By this point, computer scientists at 4 universities in the West had developed Arpanet, the first computer network, sharing data not just through the physical exchange of floppy disk, but through phone lines. Its development had been funded through the Department of Defense. Arpanet took advantage of sending small units of data known as packets, allowing information to be routed along different paths and reconstructed at the destination computers. Networks began to grow in academia and business. During the 1970s, the protocols for Arpanet improved, allowing communication between the ever-increasing number of separate networks. Increasingly, there was communication not just within individual networks, but between networks. In 1972, the first email, electronic communication that used an @ sign we know of today, was sent on an Arpanet network. Improvements still came. In 1973, Ethernet was developed. Ethernet improved Arpanet communications by avoiding collision of data packets using cable wires. It was more reliable, lost less data, and was quicker. At this point, the ground was laid in the 1970s for the World Wide Web of the 1990s. As this was going on between 1974 and 1977, the first personal computers were developed and marketed. The Tandy Corporation's TRS-80 was one of the earliest on the left here. It was marketed from its Radio Shack stores. The IBM 5100 was small enough that some consider it the first portable computer, and you can see that on the top right. On the bottom, we have the Altair 8800, which became the most popular early computer, certainly for businesses. As personal computers began to spread, two computer scientists, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, who'd improved the basic programming language, formed a company, Microsoft, to develop new computer software. Microsoft soon had strong competition. In 1976, Steve Jobs, who's shown on the left here, and Stephen Wozniak, shown on the right, started Apple Corporation, creating the Apple I computer, the first computer with a single circuit board. In 1981, Microsoft licensed its MS-DOS programming language. That was the acronym for Microsoft Disk Operating System, and they licensed it to IBM for the IBM's first PC computer. And this is going to lead to the expansion of both Microsoft and the IBM PC computer. Having supplanted Tandy Corporation in the personal computer market, Apple now challenged IBM with the introduction of its first Macintosh computer in 1984. The Macintosh had an easier use graphic interface and became the first computer to have a widely used mouse. Accordingly, it became popular with home users, while the IBM PC remained the favorite for business. In 1985, Microsoft launched its first version of its Microsoft Windows program, which popularized an improved version of Apple's earlier graphic screen interface. New and improved versions just continually followed, and you can see some of them shown here. In 1990, I could add Microsoft began its first version of the Microsoft Word for Windows programs. While not related to computers, the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987 had a profound impact on American broadcasting. More partisan talk radio emerged, and with cable television growing, Fox News was launched to appeal to a conservative audience. During the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, the popularity of CB radio, or citizen band radio, commonly used by truckers, became legal for everyone. CB radio in cars became a fad. People often communicated as they traveled. American culture today has been dominated by rapid changes in technology. The Microsoft company continued to lead in new software for computers, releasing new versions of its Windows system, making founder Bill Gates one of the richest men in the world. But by far the biggest development in the 1990s was the growth and commercialization of the Internet. British scientist Tim Berners-Lee, shown below on the left, invented the World Wide Web in 1989 when he created three fundamental technologies. HTML, or hypertext markup, was the sort of the formatting language of the web. URL, Uniform Resource Identifier, kind of like was an address that was unique for individual resources and sites on the web, while HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, allowed for the retrieval of linked resources from across the web. These three made the World Wide Web possible. Berners-Lee went on to create the first web browser in 1990 and allowed the public to join in 1991. Berners-Lee was later knighted by Queen Elizabeth. By 1994, the World Wide Web Consortium, abbreviated as W3C, was created to establish the international standards for the emerging World Wide Web. In 1995, the National Science Foundation began registering domain names for websites and immediately had over 100,000. By the end of the decade, the numbers were in the millions, and by this point, commercial interest approved by ICANN, the Internet Corporation of Assigned Names and Numbers, which was created in 1998 as a multi-stakeholder nonprofit, they controlled the domain registry process and do still today. The early Internet used traditional telephone lines and modems to connect computers, which became known as dial-up Internet. It was eventually improved with faster service in the late 1990s and early 2000s with the spread of broadband technology. In the mid-1990s, Netscape was the most popular browser and Yahoo was the most popular search engine. This was, of course, early in the Internet revolution. Google soon became the most popular search engine, so popular that people refer to looking up things on the Internet as Googling. Google was established by doctoral students at Stanford University, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, shown to the left here. With better encrypting, online businesses exploded, including in 1995 eBay, shown below left, and Amazon, the latter founded by Jeff Bezos, shown on the right. Amazon started as an online bookseller. Today, Amazon, have expanded from books to almost all products, is one of the world's largest and wealthiest companies, while Bezos ranks with Gates as one of the world's richest men. Just as in the 1990s, so much of American culture in the first decade of the 21st century was driven by technological advancement. In 2000, cell phones, which had shrunk to about the size where you could hold it in one hand, first met the Internet via a 2G network. The so-called personal digital assistants, or communicators, were expensive, slow, and marketed by companies such as Motorola and Nokia. Newer designs a bit later, such as Blackberries and Palm Pilots, were better. Everything changed in 2007 when Apple, led by Steve Jobs, released the first iPhone with its touchscreen graphics. It could pull up entire websites, take photos, and do a lot more than the earlier digital devices. But it was still primitive by today's models, lacking many of its current functions. So-called apps for iPhone didn't develop until after 2008. Very quickly, however, the phones improved and became ubiquitous. American culture was going to change tremendously and never be the same. The first social networking sites began to develop as the Internet expanded. Several of the earliest were MySpace, founded in 2003, and LinkedIn, founded the same year as a site to facilitate business connections. Soon, however, the dominant social networking site was Facebook, launched in 2004 by Harvard student Mark Zuckerberg and several of his classmates. First known as the Facebook, the site struggled through 2008 to achieve profitability, relying on investors until a model incorporating adequate advertising was established. Zuckerberg took the company public and it became a behemoth used around the world. Today, Zuckerberg stands as another leading technology billionaire. Websites were exploding in the early to mid-2000s that today define so much of American life. PayPal, launched in the late 1990s, was growing rapidly by 2008. Photobucket, founded in 2003, and Flickr, founded the following year, first facilitated online photo sharing. In 2005, YouTube, a site to share videos, was created and also grew quickly in popularity. Here you can see the original YouTube screen. In 2006, Twitter was founded, allowing participants to send brief messages of up to 140 characters and allowing them to receive automatically the so-called tweets of those they'd agreed to follow. By 2008, individual Americans across the spectrum had established what was called blogging sites. In recent years, there have been an explosion in podcasts, which had its roots back as far as the 1990s. Podcasts allowed in-depth discussions of any number of topics. Certainly, the growth in social media and the advances in instant communications have dramatically impacted newspapers. As people draw their news from the internet, many traditional hard copy newspapers have failed, while others have worked hard to transition online. Throughout it all, of course, the new technology has altered our very language as new words are coined out of necessity. From software to internet to podcasts, the American language remains as dynamic as it has been since the colonial days. From abbreviations such as LOL to emojis, the way Americans communicate will continue to change. Scholars today, for example, debate how the explosion in communications will impact regional dialects. Scholars debate whether improvements in communications will fracture or facilitate a common culture. Today, the ability to communicate instantly in a number of forms promises both good and bad for the future. Instant communication makes better organization and dissemination of information possible, with tremendous opportunity for good. Warnings of impending disasters or crowdsourcing for charities are only two examples. Now, however, if this information is false or inflammatory, it can have dire consequences, as seen in the 2021 angry mob storming the U.S. Capitol. In part driven by algorithms and social media, Americans increasingly retreat to their own siloed sources of information, communicating only with those who agree in an echo chamber that facilitates the spread of propaganda. Since the dawn of electronic communications, Americans have wrestled with balancing the protection of free speech and the necessity of preventing violence or even insurrection. This balance will only become more difficult as communications continue to improve in the future. In any event, this concludes the fourth and final video on the history of American language and communications.